June the 6th, 1944, 06:30 hours. The waters of the English Channel are pitch black and bone-chillingly cold, churning with the violence of a late spring storm. Inside the cramped, rectangular steel box of a Higgins landing craft, 36 American soldiers are packed shoulder to shoulder. The smell is suffocating, a putrid mixture of diesel exhaust, salt water, and the sour stench of vomit from men who have been violently seasick for hours. Their wool uniforms are heavy and soaked. Their hands, gripping the wooden stocks of M1 Garand rifles, are numb and trembling. This is not the trembling of cowards. It is the physiological response of the human body realizing it is about to be violently destroyed. The engine whines down. The flat bottom of the landing craft scrapes against a hidden sandbar with a metallic shriek that sets teeth on edge. The heavy steel ramp at the front begins to drop. It is supposed to be the gateway to the liberation of Europe. Instead, it falls open to reveal a mechanized slaughterhouse. Before the ramp even splashes into the surf, the darkness is shattered by thousands of muzzle flashes from the cliffs above. A terrifying, mechanical roar tears through the salty air. It sounds like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped in half. It is the signature shriek of the German MG-40 machine gun, spitting out 1,200 armor-piercing rounds every single minute. The men in the front rows do not even have time to scream. They are cut down instantly, their bodies absorbing the kinetic energy of a weapon designed solely for mass human extermination. The ramp becomes a chaotic tangle of the dead and the dying, bleeding out into the freezing waves. Those still standing behind them face an impossible choice: jump over the armored sides of the boat into 10 feet of churning ocean, weighed down by 80 pounds of gear, or step forward into the concentrated crossfire of the most perfectly engineered killing zone in military history. Welcome to WW2 Untold Moments, where history is not just told but felt. Today, we are stepping onto the blood-soaked, treacherous sands of Omaha Beach, into the very jaws of a tactical nightmare that Allied planners completely failed to foresee. We are analyzing the brilliant, ruthless, and deadly trap laid by German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. This was the sector that almost broke the United States Army on D-Day, a place where meticulous planning disintegrated within seconds of contact with the enemy. If you want to understand the true, unvarnished cost of freedom, the mechanics of warfare, and the brutal reality of military history, hit that subscribe button right now. And please, honor the legacy of the greatest generation by sharing the stories of your family's World War II veterans in the comments below. Now, let us wade into the freezing surf and face the Atlantic Wall. To comprehend the sheer scale of the massacre at Omaha Beach, one must first look through the eyes of the man who designed its defenses. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been personally appointed by Adolf Hitler to fortify the Atlantic Wall. When Rommel arrived in France in late 1943, he was appalled. The defenses were inadequate for the massive amphibious assault he knew was coming. Rommel, a veteran of brutal armored combat, understood a fundamental, unforgiving truth. If the Allies established a secure beachhead and brought their industrial superiority ashore, the Third Reich was doomed. Therefore, Rommel's strategic philosophy was absolute. The invasion had to be stopped on the beaches. The water's edge must become the main line of resistance. The battle had to be won or lost in the first 24 hours, what he famously called the longest day. When Rommel surveyed the geography of Omaha Beach, he saw the canvas for a masterpiece of destruction. Omaha was a crescent-shaped strip of golden sand, stretching for 5 miles, enclosed by sheer limestone cliffs rising up to 150 feet. To move inland, any attacking force would be funneled through 5 narrow, heavily guarded ravines, known as draws. Rommel immediately weaponized this terrain, turning the crescent into a continuous, interlocking grid of death. He knew the Allies would have to land at low tide to avoid crashing into his underwater obstacles. This meant the American infantry would have to sprint across up to 300 yards of completely open, featureless sand. So, Rommel started his defenses deep in the freezing waters of the English Channel. The outermost layer consisted of the Belgian gate's massive steel frames weighing 3 tons, topped with Teller anti-tank mines. Closer to the shore, he planted wooden ramps driven deep into the sand, capped with explosive charges meant to gut the Higgins boats. Finally, resting just at the low tide mark, were the hedgehogs. These were jagged, intersecting steel beams welded together in a star shape. Simple, but devastatingly effective at ripping through metal. But these obstacles were merely the anvil. The hammer was the network of 15 massive, heavily fortified concrete strong points, designated as wider stanzas. Overlooking that wide expanse of open sand, these bunkers housed a terrifying arsenal: 85 heavy machine gun nests, 35 anti-tank guns, and 18 heavy artillery pieces. The true, wicked genius of Rommel's plan lay in their positioning. Rommel explicitly forbade his gunners from pointing their primary weapons directly out to sea. Firing straight ahead would make muzzle flashes visible to the Allied naval armada offshore, inviting immediate counter-battery fire from battleships. Instead, the concrete bunkers were built with thick, blank walls facing the ocean, virtually immune to naval shells. The firing embrasures were angled sharply to the sides, pointing down the length of the beach. This tactical concept is known as enfilade fire. When the American soldiers dropped their ramps and looked up at the bluffs, they would see nothing but grassy hills. They would not see the guns killing them. The bullets would tear into their unprotected flanks from the sides, creating interlocking arcs of crossfire. Every single inch of Omaha Beach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. It was a geometric web of lead with absolutely zero blind spots. To shatter this impregnable fortress, the Allied High Command devised a plan relying entirely on unprecedented firepower. 450 B-24 Liberator heavy bombers were assigned to drop 1,300 tons of high explosives directly onto the German concrete strong points. Simultaneously, a massive naval flotilla would unleash a torrent of naval gunfire. Furthermore, the infantry would be supported by 64 specialized duplex-drive Sherman tanks, designed to swim to the shore and provide immediate, point-blank armored fire support. Allied planners confidently assured the infantry commanders that by the time the first boots hit the sand, Omaha Beach would be a smoking, cratered wasteland, and the German defenders would be dead or completely shell-shocked into submission. But the theoretical perfection of the planning room rarely survives the brutal friction of the battlefield. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, an unseasonal, violent weather front pushed thick, dense cloud cover and heavy mist over the coastline. The pilots of the heavy bombers, flying entirely on instruments, could not visually see their targets. Operating under strict orders to avoid accidentally dropping their payloads short and killing the incoming American armada, the bombardiers made a fatal, split-second decision. They delayed the release of their bombs by just a few seconds. Traveling at over 200 miles per hour, those few seconds translated to miles on the ground. Every single bomb dropped by the heavy bombers missed Omaha Beach completely. 1,300 tons of explosives fell harmlessly into the empty French cow pastures up to 3 miles inland. Compounding this meteorological disaster was a catastrophic failure of Allied military intelligence. The planners firmly believed that Omaha Beach was garrisoned by a low-grade, poorly equipped unit comprised mostly of older men and conscripted prisoners of war who would surrender at the first sign of combat. They were modelly wrong. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, the German 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened, fully equipped combat unit filled with veterans who had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front, had been secretly directly into the Omaha sector. They were sitting in Rommel's perfect bunkers, their weapons loaded, oiled, and ready. As the clock ticked relentlessly towards 0630 hours, the first wave of American landing craft bobbed in the violent surf, sailing directly into an untouched, fully operational fortress. The steel doors of the landing craft finally crashed open, and the theoretical nightmare of the briefing rooms instantly became the bloody reality of the dog-green sector. For the men of Company 116th Infantry Regiment, the meticulously planned invasion dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. They had been promised armored support, a rolling barrage of naval artillery, and a beach full of bomb craters for cover. Instead, they found themselves staring at a pristine stretch of golden sand, backed by towering bluffs erupting with German machine gun fire. The much-anticipated armored shield, the specialized duplex-drive Sherman tanks, had suffered a catastrophe of their own miles out at sea. Launched far too early into the churning, unpredictable swells, the fragile canvas flotation skirts of the 32 tanks were immediately overwhelmed. Water poured over the struts, swamping the heavy engines. One by one, 27 of these 30-ton metal behemoths slipped beneath the turbulent waves. Their crews were trapped inside their metal coffins in the pitch-black depths, drowning in the freezing dark. The infantrymen shivering in the Higgins boats watched in mounting horror as their only source of mobile cover vanished before their eyes, leaving them utterly naked against the most heavily fortified coastline on the planet. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, they did not offer a path to the beach. They served as a funnel for German gunners, who had pre-sighted every single inch of the landing zones months in advance. The German MG-40 machine guns, housed inside concrete pillboxes, unleashed a torrent of lead at a cyclic rate so high it sounded like tearing fabric. The overlapping arcs of enfilade fire meant that the American soldiers were not being shot at from straight ahead, but from their vulnerable flanks. The men standing at the front of the landing craft were instantly shredded, collapsing backward into their comrades. Turning the floor of the boat into a slippery pool of blood and seawater. To stay in the boat was a guaranteed death sentence, but stepping off the ramp was equally suicidal. Desperate, terrified men threw themselves over the armored sides of the Higgins boats, plunging into water that was often 8 to 10 feet deep. Here, the simple physics of the infantryman's burden became a fatal flaw. Every soldier was carrying anywhere from 60 to 80 pounds of equipment. They bore the weight of their M1 Garand rifles sealed in waterproof plastic bags, heavy canvas bandoliers packed with ammunition, fragmentation grenades, entrenching tools, canteens, gas masks, and medical kits. The specialized assault troops also carried incredibly heavy, cumbersome Bangalore torpedoes intended to clear the barbed wire. The moment these heavily laden men hit the deep water, their thick wool uniforms acted like massive sponges, absorbing pounds of freezing seawater. The weight dragged them down relentlessly. Men thrashed in the surf, desperately trying to unbuckle their webbing and shed their equipment, just to break the surface and breathe. Dozens of young Americans drowned without ever firing a single shot, their lungs filling with the icy waters of the English Channel, their bodies rolling gently in the surf alongside the sunken equipment they had abandoned. For those who managed to keep their heads above water and push through the crashing waves, the true horror of Omaha Beach awaited them. Emerging from the surf, shivering violently, vomiting from seasickness, and gasping for air, they faced a 300-yard sprint across a completely flat, exposed tidal flat. Because the heavy bombers had missed, there were no craters to dive into. The only cover available was the very obstacles Rommel had placed to stop them. Exhausted, terrified soldiers sprinted blindly toward the steel Belgian gates and the rusted iron crosses of the hedgehogs for a brief moment of respite. But Rommel had anticipated this instinct as well. The German artillery observers, peering through the slits of their concrete bunkers, had precisely registered the coordinates. As the American infantry huddled behind the steel hedgehogs, the German 88mm anti-aircraft guns and 81mm mortar began to rain high explosive shells. The 88mm gun was arguably the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. When its shells detonated against the thick steel of the beach obstacles, the explosions were catastrophic. The concussive blast alone was enough to rupture eardrums and liquefy internal organs, but the kinetic effect was even worse. The impact shattered the rusted iron of the hedgehogs, turning the anti-tank obstacles into massive, jagged pieces of secondary shrapnel that tore through the men. Flesh and bone were no match for flying steel. The noise on the beach was a physical, deafening assault on the senses, a chaotic, overlapping roar of exploding artillery, the sharp, supersonic cracks of incoming Mauser rifle fire, the continuous tearing sound of the machine guns, and the piercing, agonizing screams of the wounded crying out for medics. The company medics, marked by the prominent red crosses on their helmets, became primary targets. Those who survived the initial barrage scrambled frantically across the bullet-swept sand, sliding through the blood and mud to reach the screaming men. They carried small canvas bags equipped with tourniquets, sulfur powder, and syrettes of morphine. But the sheer volume of casualties was instantly overwhelming. Within minutes, their supplies were completely exhausted. They were reduced to tearing strips from uniforms to pack gaping chest wounds, injecting their last drops of morphine to ease the passing of men who had been ripped in half by artillery. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Combat fatigue, which usually takes weeks of sustained combat to manifest, set in within minutes. Dozens of able-bodied men, their minds utterly shattered by the sensory overload of extreme violence, simply shut down. They sat upright in the sand, staring blankly out at the ocean, their rifles discarded, completely oblivious to the bullets cracking around them, waiting passively for the end. The air was thick with a nauseating cocktail of smells. The sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood, the pungent, sulphurous odor of burning cordite, the heavy diesel fumes rolling off the burning landing craft, and the sickening stench of ruptured intestines. Within the first 20 minutes, the command structure of the assault companies completely evaporated. The German snipers situated high on the bluffs had been trained to look for the vertical white stripes painted on the back of the helmets, worn by American officers and non-commissioned officers. Lieutenants, captains, and sergeants were systematically picked off as they tried to rally their men, leaving terrified, leaderless privates pinned down in the sand. The vital -300 Seychelles rupees backpack radios, essential for calling in naval gunfire or coordinating movements, were either ruined by saltwater immersion, or their operators were specifically targeted and killed because the long, distinct antennas made them obvious marks. Without communication, there was no coordination, there was no grand strategy. The invasion of Europe had devolved into thousands of isolated, terrifying microcosms of individual survival. The American soldiers found themselves practically defenseless. The M1 Garand, though a masterpiece of semi-automatic engineering, is a precision machine with tight tolerances. As the men dragged themselves through the wet, clinging sand and the muddy surf, grit and salt water flooded the receivers of their rifles. When they finally managed to crawl behind the slight elevation of the shingle and attempted to return fire, they found their weapons hopelessly jammed. Frantic, shaking fingers tried to clear the sandy, fouled actions while bullets snapped inches above their heads, kicking up sprays of pebbles and dust. They were pinned behind a foot-high pile of rocks, unable to move forward through the dense coils of concertina wire, unable to shoot back, and unable to retreat. And then came the most sinister, agonizing element of Rommel's trap, the relentless, unforgiving tide of the English Channel. The tide at Normandy comes in at an astonishingly rapid pace, rising almost an inch every single minute. For the able-bodied men cowering behind the shingle, it was a terrifying push forward. But for the hundreds of wounded men left behind on the exposed sand, it was a slow, torturous death sentence. Soldiers with shattered femurs, severed arteries, or spinal injuries lay helplessly in the sand, watching the waterline creep closer and closer. They screamed for their comrades, begging to be dragged up the beach. But any man who left the meager cover of the shingle to run back into the open was instantly cut down. The wounded men were forced to watch as the freezing water washed over their boots, then their waists, and finally their faces. The surf along the dog-green sector turned a frothy, opaque crimson, thick with the blood of hundreds of young men, slowly drowning in the rising tide, their final moments consumed by unimaginable fear and absolute impotence. The grand crusade to free the world had ground to a bloody, seemingly permanent halt on a narrow strip of French sand. While soldiers drowned in fire and salt water, the battle reached a terrifying stalemate at the highest levels of command. Miles offshore, Aboard the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley paced the bridge in mounting agony. He squinted through binoculars, trying to make sense of the carnage. The view was apocalyptic, burning hulks of landing craft, motionless men, and no movement toward the bluffs filled his sight. Radio reports were fragments of desperation. Pinned down ... casualties extreme. Request immediate fire support. Bradley faced his most harrowing crisis, considering halting the landings and diverting waves to other beaches. This would mean catastrophic defeat, a massive gap in the Allied line, allowing Germans to roll up the invasion. The fate of the Western world teetered on a razor's edge, his mission slipping away into the red surf. Yet, a fatal flaw in the German command structure began to undermine Rommel's perfect trap from within. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who engineered this killing zone, was nearly 500 miles away. Convinced by meteorologists, Rommel had left France on June 5 to celebrate his wife's birthday. The Desert Fox missed his own longest day. German command was paralyzed by bureaucratic fear. Commanders were denied authority to release mobile reserves. Hitler was asleep at his Berchtesgaden retreat. Subordinates, terrified of his temper, refused to wake him. The German army's knockout blow was frozen. The deadlock would be broken not by generals or dictators, but by the raw grit of men dying in the sand. On Omaha Beach, military hierarchy was pulverized. Brigadiers and colonels did the work of sergeants. General Norman Dutch Kota, assistant commander of the 29th Infantry, landed in the Inferno's center. At 50, Kota was an old-school warrior. Realizing the D-Day plan was dead, walking upright along the shingle, he ignored snipers and shell bursts with supernatural defiance. He found his men huddled, paralyzed by the slaughter, knowing every second behind shingle meant annihilation. He offered a brutal, honest choice. "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." He sought the 5th Ranger Battalion, barking the order that would define their history. "Rangers, lead the way." This was the pivot point. American improvisation began to overwhelm German static defense. Small groups, led by corporals or privates, began to organize, realizing the only way off was through. They scavenged for weapons, cleaning M1 Garens with spit and rags, seeing bluffs as opportunity. Rommel's trap was designed to kill on the sand. On the slopes, Americans found seams in the armor. Commanders on the ground scrapped plans, launching chaotic, uncoordinated, but relentless assaults on the heights. It was a war of centimeters, fought with wire cutters, hand grenades, and pure, unadulterated rage. The turning point arrived with a thunderous roar, shaking German concrete widerstandsness. Offshore, U.S. Navy destroyer commanders watched the slaughter in agonizing helplessness. Without radio contact, and beach obscured by smoke, they made a decision-defying standard procedure. Destroyer captains, seeing infantry butchered, ordered their ships terrifyingly close to the shoreline. So close, infantry on the beach could see sailors on decks. At point-blank range, they turned broadsides. Their 5-inch guns barked with ferocity, drowning out the MG-42s, aiming at tiny muzzle flashes. Naval shells hit pillboxes like a hammer of God, shattering concrete, filling bunkers with dust. This provided the American infantry with the first true umbrella of covering fire they had experienced. Under this protective canopy of naval steel, the stalemate behind the shingle finally broke. Combat engineers crawled through bullet-swept sand, shoving bangle or torpedoes beneath dense concertina wire. Explosions sent dirt, wire, and debris hundreds of feet into the air, creating jagged gaps. Through these gaps, the first small groups of infantry poured, not waiting for orders or reinforcements. They moved with frantic energy, knowing to stay still was to die, scaling bluffs directly between strong points. The ascent was a nightmare of physical exertion and raw terror. Slopes were nearly vertical. Men pulled themselves up by fingernails, encountering S-mines, the dreaded bouncing Bettys. Yet, they kept climbing. German snipers looked down in disbelief as Americans emerged from impossible terrain. German gunners were in a fatal predicament. Their bunkers were blind to attacks from above or behind. American infantry bypassed primary killing zones, infiltrating the German defense network's rear. The battle transformed into brutal, intimate skirmishes. Small teams moved from bunker to bunker. Fighting was silent and terrifying, punctuated by grenade thuds and M1 Garand barks. Americans crawled to the rear of pillboxes, dropping phosphorus grenades down air vents. They used flamethrowers, incinerating German gunners, turning bunker interiors into oxygen-starved furnaces. One by one, the MG-42s that dominated Omaha Beach fell silent. The heights were being won. By 1100 hours, the first narrow pathways to the top had been secured. Rommel's perfect trap was breached, not by a grand armored thrust, but by the sheer, bloody willpower of men who refused to accept death. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent over the English Channel, the frantic violence that had defined the morning at Omaha Beach began to crystallize into a grim, hollow silence. By 1300 hours, American soldiers had finally clawed their way off the sand and onto the heights, but the scene they left behind was one of absolute, soul-crushing devastation. The beach, once a pristine crescent of French sand, had been transformed into a sprawling junkyard of broken machines and broken men. From the bluffs, the view was apocalyptic. The tidal flat was littered with scorched, skeletal remains of hundreds of landing craft. Their steel ramps still dropped like open mouths. The hulks of sunken duplex-drive tanks sat like tombstones in the shallows, their canvas skirts shredded by the surf. Every few yards, a jeep, a half-track, or abandoned crates lay twisted and burning, sending thick plumes of black, oily smoke into the salt air. But the most haunting sight was the human wreckage. The tide, a terrifying instrument of death, now receded to reveal the true cost of Rommel's trap. Thousands of discarded gas masks, life belts, and blood-soaked wool jackets were strewn across the sand like debris from a shipwreck, and among them lay the soldiers. Some were huddled in groups behind rusted iron hedgehogs where they had taken their final breath. Others lay alone, half buried in the wet sand, their faces turned toward the cliffs they had died trying to reach. Medical corpsmen, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and their uniforms stiff with dried blood, moved slowly among the bodies. They were no longer rushing, they were performing the somber, repetitive task of separating the living from the dead. For every man being carried onto a hospital ship, 2 more were being laid in long, silent rows, their ponchos pulled over their faces. The psychological weight of the aftermath was as heavy as the physical destruction. For the survivors now huddled in the hedgerows of the French countryside, the adrenaline of the assault had vanished, replaced by a numbing, pervasive sense of loss. Entire squads had been wiped out. Best friends who had trained together for years in England had vanished in a single burst of MG-40 to fire. The realization of their own survival felt less like a victory and more like a fluke of physics, a matter of standing an inch to the left or jumping a second earlier. As the first night on French soil fell, these men did not celebrate. They dug into the damp earth, clutching rifles still gritty with Omaha sand, and listened to the distant, rhythmic boom of naval guns continuing to pound the inland German positions. They were no longer the same men who had joked on the transport ships the night before. They were veterans of a massacre, and the shadow of the perfect kill zone would follow them across every mile of Europe until the war's final day. Erwin Rommel's tactical design had been a masterpiece of defensive engineering, and on June 6, 1944, it did exactly what it was meant to do. It stripped the American army of its armor, its communication, and its leadership within the first 60 minutes. It turned a modern, industrial military force back into a collection of terrified individuals fighting for their lives with stones and bayonets. The trap had almost worked. If the German High Command had not been paralyzed by bureaucracy, or if Rommel himself had been present to release the 21st Panzer Division for a counterattack, the invasion of Normandy might have ended in a catastrophe that would have altered the course of human history. But the untold moment of Omaha Beach is that the Atlantic Wall was not broken by a better plan or superior technology. It was broken by the sheer, uncalculated resilience of the human spirit. It was broken because, in the absence of orders, ordinary men found extraordinary courage. It was broken because a private refused to stay in the water, because a sergeant decided to crawl toward the wire, and because a destroyer captain decided to risk his ship to save the men on the sand. The legacy of Omaha Beach is a testament to the fact that no trap, no matter how perfectly engineered, can account for the unpredictable power of individual initiative in the face of absolute terror. History is more than just dates on a page, it's endurance, sacrifice, and survival. The victory at Omaha Beach secured the Allied foothold in Europe and marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but it remains a somber reminder of the staggering price paid for every inch of that progress. We owe it to those who stayed on that beach to remember not just the victory, but the brutal reality of the struggle. Thank you for joining us at WW2 Untold Moments. If this deep dive into Rommel's trap and the courage of the American infantry changed your perspective on D-Day, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. To explore more tactical breakdowns and the raw, human experiences of the Second World War, click on the video on your screen right now. We will see you on the next battlefield.